start our recording now and make the next hour or so of this webcast available to people who were interested in what we have to say but unable to join at this time. And if any of you would like a copy of the recording to share with colleagues, by all means, just let us know. Hey, good to meet you. How you doing? Perfect. So this webinar, we decided that people might like a little bit of insider advice on shaping proposals for the upcoming Symposium of the Graduation Initiative, which is happening next September, the third week of September, adjacent to the scheduled meeting of the CSU Board of Trustees. And the purpose of that scheduling was to make it as easy as possible for decision makers in our system, the presidents, the trustees, and others, to pay attention to some of the best work going on around the system, which we hope is represented by many of you joining on this webcast. So we're going to present this to you, I think, in three parts. I'll share a little bit about the symposium itself and where we are in the graduation initiative. Robin Pennington, who's out of the office today, but an important part of our team, may be joining remotely to talk through some of the key parts of the RFP. If she's not available on this webcast, then any of us can handle it too, because we all worked on it together. And then for the third part, I'll turn things over to Jeff and Ed to talk about some of the things that we're looking for between the lines of the RFP, so what it is that we value. A lot of what you're hearing, and Robin may go over this in more detail, is drawn from what we learned by working over the summer with the designated advisors to the Graduation Initiative 2025 team. And then finally, the fourth person on camera with us right now, Susie Cuevas, is someone whose name you know at least because it's on the RFP. And so if you've got questions about the submission process at all, or other things that you need to know about how to apply, she is your person. Any opening comments or questions before I jump in?
Nice.
We so seldom get singing on these webinars.
Ken, I have a question.
Sure, pose your question.
If there's time, can we ask questions about the Campus 2025 proposals that are due on the 2nd or whatever day it is?
Yes.
Okay.
And we may know the answers.
And if you don't, you can go find them and, you know.
That's right. Yeah, but actually we've only got about, I think, between us all, 5 or 10 minutes of material for a 1-hour slot. So okay. we really were picturing this as a question and answer period. And if it ends early, it ends early. So by all means, you will have time for questions.
Lovely, thanks.
Sure.
Well, it's nice.
All right, with that, yeah.
This is Mary Beth. Hello, you all.
Hi. Hey, Mary Beth.
Very nice to see you there. And it's nice that we have this kind of connection in the Chancellor's office. So thank you in advance.
You are so welcome. And I think that's a Mary Legion sighting I have over your shoulder.
It's Vicky Legion.
Vicky Legion. I'm sorry. I was reading the name just as I was saying the name and it threw me off. Yeah. Hi, Vicky. Nice to see you.
And I just want to say I'm not trying to distract you with the scenery behind me, but my house is a dead zone, and so I have to be out to use it.
Well, it looks enviable.
Yeah.
So here's where we are in the graduation initiative. I think almost all of you are familiar with where we are in this effort. It began in 2009 with some very ambitious 6-year goals. We met and even exceeded those goals. As a result, as we embark on this second phase, people are asking us to be more ambitious in a number of different ways. First, by raising the target on the 6-year rate, the transfer rates, etc. But in other ways, with a different level of urgency, our chancellor last year challenged us to zero out our achievement gaps, not just cut them in half the way we tried to the first time, but actually eliminate them altogether. So going forward, you can look for a greater focus on equity, on campus climate, on ways we can include all of our students in our student success efforts. The second relatively new source of increasingly urgent pressure has to do with time to degree and communication we've been getting from the governor's office and the Department of Finance to focus on the 4-year graduation rate and what it takes to improve that in the same dramatic way we've been improving our 6-year rate. Those of you who've been at this for a while understand that that implies a different kind of intervention. Getting students to persist to degree, engaging them in their learning, making them feel a connection to the campus environment, all of those things will improve the 6-year rate. But to improve the 4-year rate, you need all those things plus an attention to things like analysis of demand for different course sections, clear degree roadmaps, appropriate credit for prior learning at the point that the student enters, some of the ongoing electronic e-advising tools that are coming on the market look extremely valuable for us. And then a more responsive and nuanced way of building class schedules. For us to really improve our 4-year rate, we're going to be looking at those tools probably more than we did in the first phase when we were just interested in the graduation rates overall. This symposium in September is at the fulcrum of those 2 efforts of the graduation initiative. We see it first as a chance to celebrate the successes of the first phase and to highlight some of the campus-based programs that led us to those successes. You folks, by and large, know more about those programs than we do. Some of them were centrally funded, like the ASSP programs, the bottleneck programs, but a lot of them weren't. And what we were hearing from campuses was an interest in seeing what each other is working on that may not always be part of the spotlight at the system level. In other words, we were being told that there are all kinds of valuable student success efforts on the campuses that just don't happen to have system-wide branding or visibility yet. And you wanted a chance to see what each other had been up to. The forward-thinking part of the symposium is a look at how we can expect to achieve the goals of Graduation Initiative 2025. So we're also looking for programs that will improve time to degree, close our equity gaps, and deliver on these new ambitious targets for 2025. Finally, you should know that invited to the same symposium will be grant makers, policy makers, leadership at the state level. So we want to look good at this meeting. And for that reason, we're going to be very careful about which of the presentation proposals we select for highlighting at this meeting. And there'll be 2 ways to be selected. One, you could get one of the 16 live presentation slots that will be built into the program of the symposium. And if you're selected for those, we'll ask you to come down to participate. We'll defray your travel costs, and it won't count against the cap on the number of team members from each campus. In other words, you'll be coming along as a freebie. If you're not selected for that, but if your program looks nonetheless noteworthy and valuable for pointing out to others, then we'll find other ways to get you some attention via this symposium. It could be included in the program, for example. It could show up on a related website. Until we see exactly what the submissions are from the campuses, we're not sure how many of those there might be or what the best format will be for communicating them to our audience. But we know that we don't want to commit ourselves to limiting the field to 16. 16 is just a reality of the venue and of the time and of how much attention we can demand from people in real time. But we have a feeling there are more stories than that to tell. I'm going to ask Robin now to talk through the steps of the RFP itself so that you folks can see what your programs will be getting evaluated on. But before I do, let me just ask if you have any questions, reactions, or comments to what I was just talking about.
Can I do?
Yeah.
This is Mary Beth. Do you think that the interest in grad rates is equally, in other words, if we're doing work in the community colleges, do you want to see that as well, even though this is a CSU symposium?
Really good question. And as you know, our relationship with our community colleges is huge for us. Most of our graduates are transfer students, and we did build in a couple of targets for the transfer rate.
Okay, good. I'll call you back, and you know, if you left already, I'll just try yourself.
Okay, that's okay.
Thank you.
So I would say, to the extent you can demonstrate that it has been improving student success for your transfer students after they get to San Francisco State, yes, that would be a good contender. If instead it's showing some of the other things we value, like student engagement at the community colleges, better persistence, more successful transfer rates, this symposium may not be the right venue for it, even though it's valuable work.
Can I have a follow-up question, Ken?
Sure.
What if you're addressing equity in transfer?
Same story. If it's affecting our bottom line, our graduation rates at the CSU,
Okay.
then heck yes, make the submission. If not, if it's a more nuanced or broader story you're telling about equity beyond just our segment, we care about it. We want to highlight it somewhere, but maybe not here.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Sure. Really good question. Hey, Robin, are you able to join? Oh, do either of you want to add to any of the overview I just provided? Ed?
I think the one angle to also consider, in addition to the programs that are working, is to also think about the leadership efforts that you guys have made that might be game changing. In other words, you may have taken on some new ideas, changed an approach, rethought how you did business. That would have value as well. Anything that was large scale or even moderate scale and maybe shifted the institution's culture would be very valuable to hear about in the symposium.
May I ask a question related to that?
Sure, go ahead.
Chris Linfeld. Bridget and I and Jazzy, that one I saw as well.
Okay, great.
7 or 8 others have put together what we call the California Collaborative that I think, Ken, you're well aware of. But is that something, I mean, it's a little bit outside of the scope, but on the other hand, it's like a huge...
Well, we'll look forward. Thanks so much. Okay, great. All right, bye now.
I'm sorry, I'm kind of getting confused here.
Can we ask people to mute their mics?
Yeah, and I'm looking to see sometimes if the frame lights up and I can see who's doing the talking, I can mute them for them, but on that one I missed it.
Okay. Did my question...
Rick, I think you're asking a great question about the California Collaboratives.
Yeah.
For those of you on...
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead, please.
Okay, so for those of you on this meeting who aren't familiar with that effort, it's a very ambitious, I think groundbreaking, intersegmental collaborative of advisors in the community colleges, in the UC, in the CSU, and in the privates, all trying to get our signals straight and our messages consistent to students about how they can move through our connected systems. It's about 2 years old, and so my hunch is that it would pass the criteria for innovation and scale, but it's unlikely to pass the criteria for evidence of effectiveness, just because the effort is so new. But if you've got early indications that this approach is making a difference, especially for equity or for time to degree, then I would say go ahead and make the submission. You know, it'll depend on how it stacks up against the other submissions that we see, but it is at least the kind of work that we want to highlight.
Okay, thank you very much.
Sure.
Ken, this is Beth
Yeah.
Hartung. May I ask a question?
Sure, go ahead, Beth.
I'm asking on behalf of some colleagues who want to submit a proposal, and these may be premature, but one question was about whether or not we could bring a student or two if the presentation was accepted, the length of the presentation, and the number of presenters allowed.
Really good questions. On bringing the student, I would say, as you sort of implied in your question, it would depend a little bit on the nature of the presentation and how much the student would add to the presentation. But I think in general, it's a good idea. And normally when students present at meetings like this, it goes over very well. On the number of presenters or the length, do you happen to know?
Well, the length is an hour, and we haven't set a bar on the number. I think it's going to kind of depend on capacity. One thing that Ken didn't say is that what we're working with is a total capacity of 250 total spaces. And so when you look at the way that we've divided things up with, I think, 8 invitations per campus, plus chancellor's office folks, plus speakers, plus invited guests, we get really close to that 250 number very quickly. And so to the extent that we're able to get right to that number as close as possible, I think the answer will be the more the merrier. And if we're looking as we get closer to that September date of being close to that 250 number, we may have to push back a little bit on the speaker number. But we should have a good sense of that in the next few weeks.
Good.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
This is trivial, I know, but just FYI, the hotel is totally full for the reduced price.
Yes, thank you. And it's, well, it is and it is not trivial. I was sorry to see that the block of rooms just blew out as fast as it did. We are working with other local hotels to make sure people get the state rate, but we don't have that deep discount on the blocks anymore. Those are all taken. Robin, are you on?
I am. Can you hear me?
Terrific. Yes, we can hear you. Do you want to talk a little bit through the RFP itself?
I would love to. Let me begin by saying, I believe Ken mentioned this. So this RFP arose out of the conversations and work of the advisory committee that met over the summer. So let me just tell you a little bit about that committee for those of you that aren't quite as familiar with the work that they did. So in June, there was a system-wide committee, Graduation Initiative 2025 Advisory Committee that was convened. The committee was made up of trustees, presidents, provosts, vice presidents of student affairs, institutional research representatives, and faculty and student members. So this group met 3 times over the summer, and their primary objective was to recommend target ranges for the system-wide goals for the CSU for 2025, and also provide recommendations for how we might arise at our campus targets, so how we might go through that process. So that's the work that this group did. They did express during the meetings that it was very important, they thought, to identify the great practices or best practices that are going on at our campuses, share those in an effort to potentially scale them up or implement them at other campuses where there were successes. So thus this request for proposals for practices that are going on at your campuses. So with that, I think I'll walk through each of the pages of the RFP, and then at the end or throughout, if you do have questions, please let me know. So as mentioned, the purpose of this is to share the best practices or great practices of programs or services that you have implemented at your campus that you think are worthy of sharing with other campuses, because maybe it's something that could be either scaled across a campus or leveraged across multiple campuses. So that's what we're looking for. The submission deadline is coming up. It's August 19th, so that's soon, but hopefully you've been thinking about this for a little while now. We do ask that there is at least one senior administrator as a co-presenter. So that's kind of in an effort to, the audience at the symposium will be made up primarily of campus senior leaders. And so we'd like to have one of their peers participate in the presentation, but knowing that the subject matter experts at your campus might be somebody who is at a different level. But we would like one senior leader to be a participant in this. We will provide travel or cover travel costs for those that do have a proposal accepted. We are asking that each campus, to the extent that you're able to coordinate this, limit your proposals to 5 per campus. I think I would also say that if you're not able to coordinate across your campus and you accidentally submit 6, that's probably okay, because as Ken mentioned previously, we'll be looking for certain elements when we make the final decision on which presentations to include in the symposium, and it will be a good mix of different types of programs, different campuses, etc. So we will be wanting to showcase different types of programs that have been successful. And I do want to say that the selection committee will be made up of some of the those graduation initiative advisory committee members who were those that initially requested this type of presentation at the symposium. So with that, we'll just kind of go through some of the elements on the rest of the pages here. I won't spend too much time on some of them, but I will point out some that are key to us. So on page 2, we just want the contact information for the presenters and the senior administrator that will be participating in the presentation. We do want an abstract, so what in general is the theme of your presentation. Page 3 at the top, we are asking you to choose a track. You can choose multiple tracks if you do think that it impacts multiple areas. We thought that we could probably expand this, but we tried to just narrow it down to what do we think the 5 major categories might be. So hopefully you can fit within one of those categories, but just do your best there. So as far as the program details, we obviously want to know, so what need is this program addressing? What is the problem that you were trying to solve when you implemented the program? We do want to know what your specific objectives or desired outcomes are. What is it that you're trying to achieve by implementing this program? Page 4. How is the program structured, and then what resources does it need? And I think that that is important when we're talking about scaling something up within an institution or across institutions. It's important to know the level of staffing or equipment or other infrastructure that's needed in order to support that particular program. Item number 5 on page 4. So what in your mind do you think is the potential to be able to scale this up? And so this is something that will be key to us in the selection process for this presentation. How can it be applicable within an institution or across institutions?
Can I stop?
And then on, oh, absolutely.
I'm sorry. I had a question when I was writing. Right there is, I mean, it's scalable, but I was thinking to myself, just about everything's scalable if we have enough time and money. But
well, yes.
Yeah, and so I mean, in that, how are you looking for it is scalable? But yeah, I mean, with more infrastructure and with more money, and it's infinitely scalable, in my opinion.
That is an extremely good question, because obviously there's so much more we could do with unlimited resources. Right. So I think I would say, to the extent that you think or believe that it could be reasonable that another university or department or area could implement something. And I don't know if any of you at the table there at the Chancellor's office have any other thoughts on that.
No, we actually, just as you were talking, I don't know if you can see us, but Ed just passed me a note as you were talking where he wrote reasonableness, which I think is true.
Oh, perfect.
Isn't that funny? Yeah, I mean, you both kind of landed on the same principle, and I think that'll be the one that we share with the with each other as we talk through the proposals we get, and also with the readers who are on the committee. So it's going to be how good a case can you make that this could be scaled given the kinds of constraints we've ordinarily seen.
Hi, this is Maureen Starberg from East Bay. What I was surprised was sort of missing, that it's sort of this touching on with scalable, was the sustainability of these programs. It might be scalable, but for how long? So I was just a little bit, I just wanted to throw that out there, because I don't know whether you want us to touch on our proposals about if it is scalable, what about being sustainable?
Oh, I really, I like that. I think that for those listening on this call, to the extent that you can consider that, because obviously that's important. We don't want to implement something that that can't last longer than a year or two. So very good point, and clearly missing from the RFP, but certainly something that's worth addressing. Okay, so quickly, just the last couple of pages, page 5 and 6. So this is also something that we think is very important, which is evidence of success. So what is telling you that this program is successful? What data are you collecting to tell you that it's working? So what were your findings? So this is telling us how you're demonstrating that, that this program is worthy of consideration in other institutions or across institutions. So let us know how many students this is benefiting. So that could also be key. Is it benefiting a key group of students, but a small pocket of students versus a large amount of students? So that also, the level of impact, I think is something that's important as well. And then did you compare groups? Did you use this intervention on one group of students versus another? And are you able to show that there is differences in those two groups? So to the extent that you're able to demonstrate the evidence that you feel is showing that this is a successful program, that is something that the committee will be reviewing and will be important to the decision-making process in terms of selection for inclusion. So with that, I think I've gone through all of the pages. So are there any other questions regarding the RFP itself?
Yeah, this is Mary Beth again. Thank you for walking through that with us. I'm wondering if you can just address this last question, and I wonder if what you're saying there is, do we have selection bias?
Yep. Yeah, this is Jeff. That's a big part of it. Sorry, go ahead, Robin.
Oh no, go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, so I think that's a big part of it, right? So if we're trying to tease out the effect of your program on a variety of outcome variables, the question is, are you working with, when you're trying to create control groups or really understand the impact of this program, who are you starting with? How are those students maybe different or maybe similar from the students that you're comparing them to? Exactly.
Okay, thank you.
But also it's always going to be in these, well, at least the that I'm thinking of and the stuff I'm going to put forward is going to be correlational, and there's many other interventions or many other points that students or causes for students to be successful. So you can increase the correlation to make it look like your intervention is actually doing something, but it'll never be more than a correlation.
Right, and I think this question is just asking you to point those things out, right? So nothing too fancy in answer 6 here, but just really who are your students? How might they be different, or are they really similar to other similar students to whom you're comparing them, to give us this evidence?
Thank you.
And this is Mary Beth again, and I'm sorry that I may not have read this as maybe it says it in here somewhere, but since I have you, I'll ask. Is there a maximum number of pages? In other words, I assume these boxes expand as we get in there.
I assume so. Do they?
Yeah, they do.
They do.
Okay.
Is there a
no maximum?
No maximum. Don't annoy
That's right.
Okay. And
So
then
start typing. You have 1 week.
that's not funny. Then my next question is, and I'm sorry we did jump on a tad late, and I think you already said this, but is there a number of speakers that you're looking for? Yeah, that's the question.
No, there's not. Although, as Jeff pointed out earlier, we do have a cap on the venue's total number of slots. And so that might put some pressure on how many presenters we can bring in.
So you would suggest that we tell you how many we think can do a great job, and then you might come back to us and say you need to cut that down.
Yeah, and I'd actually so I think you probably need to make a good case for more than 4. So the 2 to 4 range, when you have an administrator and then, someone else, probably a minimum of 2. There could be 1 in some cases, but, minimum of 1 or 2. And then, just off the top of my head, doing the numbers, I think we're going to need to cap it at 3 or 4 probably, with some exceptions if needed.
And then one other question, which is, I did notice that you are looking for hands-on, interactive. Can you just say a word about that? I mean, besides good pedagogy, do you really want us putting in people in groups and having them discuss things? Tell me what your objective is there. Is it just so people aren't falling asleep?
That's a great
Yeah, I think
question
it's
for only an hour.
What's that?
Yeah, it's a good
That's a
point when
great
it's not
question if we only have an hour.
Yeah, no, and I think it's the first part, which is the good pedagogy and the engagement. So figure you're in a room with at least representation from the majority of the 23 campuses with their own realities and their own environments. And so as you're presenting the context of your program, really the spirit of that hands-on component is to engage the audience in a way that allows them to apply their context. Now, whether it's a pair share or a small group discussion or just a whole group discussion or touching the technology that you've implemented, that's up to you. But I think the spirit of the answer to that is the very first thing you said, which is the engaging pedagogy to be attentive to the context of the other folks in the room.
Great. Thank you, Jeff.
Wait, so sorry, this is Brian speaking, so just wanted to check my understanding.
I'm sorry, Brian, it's kind of hard to hear you.
Okay, it's always hard to hear me. Is this better?
Yes.
Yes, much.
All right, good. So just to check my understanding, we have an hour for 16 presentations or 16-hour-long presentation?
It's the latter. We have 16 one-hour slots, and they're grouped concurrently. So you could expect to have, if we get our 250 attending, you'd probably have a quarter of those in the room with you.
One thing that occurs to me might be, I'm not sure that we would need an entire hour. Can we consider 30-minute presentations that might allow people to go to more of them?
It's a great question. My own feeling is that we won't know until we see the proposals and what the spectrum is out there. I think the risk with a symposium like this is that it's a blur. And my own preference as one of the group organizing this is for fewer stories that are deeper and more compelling and likelier to make a lasting impression. And so if you find that you can explain the program quickly and you don't need an hour to explain it, then you might consider other uses of the rest of that airtime that aren't a description of the program, but maybe testimonials about its benefits or speculation on what else you could do with programs like this, or surprises you saw in the data that were counterintuitive or suggest a different reason that it's effective. But my own feeling is that we limited it to 16 rather than 23 so that everyone gets a slot, because we really were going for quality control. If we're done with the RFP, and we can always double back and ask more follow-up questions as the conversation unfolds. Oh yes, we've got a question. Go ahead. The people in the big conference room waving, and I can't see. Is that, it looks like Fullerton. Is that Joe Luzzi? Let me, okay, you are now unmuted.
Research?
You are, yes, it's coming through now. I just unmuted you, Fullerton. Dive in.
Okay, I have questions for two questions for participant and non-participant and unobservable variables such as motivation. Are you thinking of like a supplemental instruction type that I did sophisticated research for the past, like SI participant and non-participant differences controlling for their pre-factors? But for our case, we are working on different types of kind of technological tool this time. So number 5 and 6 in last two questions are not that much applicable for this case. So is it required?
I can talk about that. Okay. Yeah, so Sunny, hey, this is Jeff. I think you're right. So number 5 and number 6 are not going to be available for all of your programs. You won't have done it for probably the majority of the submissions will not have strong statistical analyses with comparison groups.
Right.
Some will. That's why we asked
Right.
for it. In the case of the one that you're talking about, sometimes they won't be applicable as well. So you're absolutely right. Ed, did you want to add something?
Yeah. So the answer of not applicable would be appropriate in those fields that are not applicable.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
I didn't write that question, and so you should go with the answer you just heard. But I'm going to share with you folks how I read it. A question came up a little earlier about the difference between correlation and cause, and the question about interaction effects when you're trying to do a whole lot of different things all at once to change a campus culture. And you can't always find a smoking gun that says, this intervention eliminated my gaps. It seldom works that way. It's much more often, this intervention helped set a new tone on our campus. It probably had an invisible impact on half a dozen other programs, and eventually we saw the needle move. That's normally how stories like this play out. And if you need to use one of these boxes to tell a story like that, I would say dive in. All right, I think we're ready then for the third. I don't see any other hands waving among the muted participants, so I'm going to go on to the third part of what we were planning just in terms of the informal agenda for this. And that is to invite Ed and Jeff to talk a little bit about the priorities in terms of the evidence we're asking. There's a few references in the RFP to show us how you know it's working. And Ed, if you don't mind, I'd like you to start with what you mean by working.
Well, it's that wonderful thing of working. Working actually means working. In other words, are you affecting a group in a way that's actually going to change the outcomes for your institution? That's a horrible way to phrase this. Sorry about that.
I've also heard you talk about institutional strategic thinking and moving the needle in a way that's about concerted action.
Yeah. So now that I understand where we're going, one of the keys that we've talked about internally is the purposefulness of effort that are achieved on the campus. And in a lot of ways, those are going to be revealed within the programs that you guys choose to put forward for us, and also how those have played out. Things such as the campus really didn't have a strategic plan. It had more of a strategic will of 400 different things that masked as a strategic plan suddenly became a true strategic plan with measurable goals and objectives that became a North Star for your campus. Those sorts of things drive a campus cultural change, provide a purposefulness of effort, and get the campus behind driving toward a goal. And I think those are the sorts of things, if they're occurring at your campus, that have value being shared. Because in those are the changes that come with adapting to the metrics and other things that underlie that strategic plan. It's the game-changing things that I talked about a little earlier, the things that actually make a difference, not move 4 or 5 students, but move the middle of the population. Things that narrow gaps in meaningful ways, not for a very small group, but for all students. Things that differentially improve outcomes for students. I think that's a good starting point, and I probably should tip to Jeff.
Oh, sure. Yes. So just a quick comment. I think what we had in mind on the evidence part was, Rob and Ken and I, along with Ephraim at the time, the Executive Vice Chancellor, made a visit to just about all of your campuses about 4 years ago. And in those visits, we met with many of you, faculty, presidents, students, all the way through. One of the things we saw was just a heck of a lot about the great work you're doing on campus, the different programs. But to give an example of our thinking behind this RFP related to that, we saw, for example, great early start programs, summer bridge programs, great LGBT clubs, you name it. We saw across the board. Now, some of these things had a real impact at scale. Some of them weren't measured at all yet, and some of them were very boutique. So they were fantastic programs. You had great results, but as Ed mentioned, it was for a handful of students. So I think the whole evidence section here and the philosophy of what we're trying to do is that for the purpose of this conference, since it's tied strategically into those 6 goals, which if you have seen them, they're incredibly stretch goals. They're very ambitious. we want to focus for the purpose of this conference on the larger scale, kind of more strategic initiatives that really are moving the needle, as Ed said, for that middle population, for a lot of students at scale, and have results to show behind it. So.
Thanks.
Jeff,
yeah, go ahead.
This is Mary Beth again. Is there a place we can see these the stretch goals for each of the campuses, assuming that they are different? And then how was that calculated?
So the goals for your own campuses are sitting at your president's office right now, and they're still under review. And we don't right now we're still formulating the system goals, and we're still working with the presidents on the campus goals. And so the answer to that question is eventually we will have those available, but not yet. And this all leads to a board meeting where they need to be officially approved. So we won't post anything until they are officially approved. The second part of your question is a long answer about how were they developed. Robin mentioned that there was a committee, an advisory committee consisting of a variety of folks that met 3 times, and there was a fairly sophisticated methodology used to develop campus peers for each of the 23 campuses, so 15 peers, and then set a benchmark for where campuses should be on all those goals today, and then a growth factor for 10 years from now for 2025. So along with the goal packet that was sent to each of your campuses, there's an explanation of the methodology and an FAQ along with it to explain, what's this process, why is this important, and how did we derive these goals. So Mary Beth, it's kind of I hate to weasel around. The answer is you will get all the information. Right now it's kind of sequestered in your president's office to be shared at his or her discretion. Eventually, after the September board meeting, we'll be out there with here's the system goals, here are the campus goals, and here's how they were derived.
So can I have one follow-up to that? And it's not very relevant. It's not maybe relevant to this RFP, but it is relevant, I think, for all of us. And that is that we're all very aware that this is a hot topic at the legislature and with the governor and with our chancellor. Are we thinking that new resources may come in if we start hitting some of those or get close, or is there any promise of research as we bear down on these goals, resources as we bear down on these goals?
Yeah, great question. And unfortunately, there's no promise. So what we have heard internally and what we've shared is that $35 million that is attached to these goals. So hopefully the board is going to approve the recommendations in the September meeting. Immediately subsequent to that, we are going to send the final plans along with the final goals to the Department of Finance and the state for them to hopefully also approve and say, here you go, here's the $35 million. Now that's one-time funds. And there is no implicit or explicit promise that there will be anything coming beyond that. That said, there have been some conversations and some hintings that it is possible that $35 million would turn into a more permanent baseline funding in the future. But those are just kind of back office, backroom conversations. And I don't know that anyone has any power or is really thinking that far down the line. Longer term, part of the strategic plans that we'll set up so there's the plans that go to the state as part of the release of the $35 million at the end of September. But then there's a longer term strategic planning process that the campuses will undertake beginning in October and going through probably the next year through January, February, to really think through the student success strategic plans and identify resources as well. So we hope to position all that to make the case for a revenue stream that is commensurate with our goals. And so we're already thinking, Ed and a couple folks in our office now are trying to come up with dollar figures behind what the costs might look like in the aggregate moving forward. But this is all right now just kind of an exercise into showing that this won't happen without a more consistent commitment to funding and articulating that argument not only with this average cost that Ed's working on, but also with how we position the $35 million and what we have to show for it, even though it will be such a quick turnaround by the time we ask for the next amount, if that makes sense.
And a little more on the $35 million. That money is, in the bill language, very specifically assigned to improvement of 4-year rates for freshmen, 2-year rates for transfers, and nothing else.
Yep.
Did you say 4 years? The 35 is for 4 year?
4-year rate, no, 35 million. The requirement of the bill is that that money gets spent specifically on the 4-year rates for first-time freshmen and the 2-year rates for transfers, and nothing else.
But the goals that the president's got are 6-year goals.
The goals for the presidents, as Jeff shared, will be shared along the lines of Jeff's timeline. 2 very different things.
Yeah. So let me tie those together for you. It is a little confusing. We had the graduation initiative that began in 2009 and finished in 2015, at which time we exceeded our goals for the 6-year graduation rate. We, just before the end of the 2015 graduation initiative, so in 2014, we rebenched the goals and we said, we are going to start our own graduation of 2025. Here's our goals. We then, as a result, in some ways, were victims of our own success. In the last 2 years of the grad initiative, particularly our 6-year rates have reached a very high level. So, for example, we set a goal for 2025 6-year graduation rates of 60%. Before we knew that we were well on our way to 60%, we were currently at 57%. So we had decided, independent of what the state government was going to, what their opinion would be, we had decided we need to spend this summer rebenching, looking at those old goals, coming back to the well, and figuring out what more reasonable stretch targets would be. It just so happens that the state government, the Department of Finance, heard about that and also latched onto that and said, hey, not only do we want you to do that, we want you to be incredibly aggressive, and we care mostly about 2 of your goals, not the other 4. So we care mostly about the 2-year rate for for transfers, and the 4-year rate for our freshmen. And we're going to throw this carrot, independent of your graduation initiative, but for us, the carrot is the $35 million and the plans that we're setting up for that. When I talked about the larger strategic planning effort that'll begin in October, that's around the 6 goals and around all, the whole kit and caboodle.
Okay. Thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I'm going to close with just a thought about the subtext to the question Mary Beth just posed. Is the attention from the state and the attachment of the 35 million of foreshadowing of funding models to come? And we don't know. We do know that the same folks who are showing that kind of interest will be somehow tuned in to this symposium. And that it represents for us a chance to show that, yes, we can do great things with what we're given. And so the presentations that you submit, some of these questions around scaling, around evidence of impact, around a demonstrated ability to close gaps, we do think they're relevant. And we do think that showing ourselves in the best light possible will help us with these budget negotiations going forward. You know all of us pretty well because we keep bugging you. So if any questions come up between now and the Friday deadline on your proposals, by all means, contact any of us. And all of you have Susie's email address right now because it's on this RFP. Any closing thoughts?
Yeah, before we close,
sure.
For Elizabeth, did your question get answered about the plans from the beginning?
No, it didn't. Thanks for coming back to me, Jeff.
Oh, thanks, I forgot.
We're putting together the draft of that plan since it's due not very long after the RFP, and it seems to separate short-term goals from long-term goals. I mean, it does separate short-term goals from long-term goals, and it's not clear what the format should be in terms of as we make our proposals around the $35 million, which presumably is part of what this plan is about, how we should distinguish what we're going to do in 16-17 from what we're doing long term. Because presumably anything start in 16-17 is not going to be a one-time thing, it's going to be an ongoing thing, and we've got to figure out how to make that work.
Yeah, so the question is, how do I distinguish the strategies and the, my plan for the short term versus the long term?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, sure. So, and I think we're open there. I think this was part of the requirements of, based on our discussions with the Department of Finance. I think they want to see two angles of this. The longer term is much easier if you think without being, super specific, but if you think at a high level, where are the most important components that you want to focus? So, for example, is it in advising? Is it in curriculum? Is it, where are the big areas where you think you could make the most improvements, over the next, say, 3 to 8 years? That's and walk us through why and how and what that looks like. That's the longer term. And then the shorter term, I think, is certainly 16, 17, but could be a little bit beyond. I mean, in the near term, consistent with those high level views of where you want to be several years from now, what might this look like just in the short term? So, one of the things that we've talked about quite a bit, it's, more true on some campuses than others, is that just a more attentive and intentional look at when students are graduating now and what can be done on an intervention basis. So that the example that we gave at the last board meeting that we talked about a lot is that as a system, there were, last year, there were, over 4,000 students that graduated in four years and 1 semester, or 4 years and 1 quarter. And so if we were to have all of those students, if we were to have reached out to them in their sophomore, junior, and senior years and pushed them a little bit further, and if we were to have captured all of those students as a system, our 4-year graduation rate would have gone from 19% to 27% just by doing that. So that's one example that we've used frequently that I think has hit home with the Department of Finance and others as an example of something that might be able to be done fairly quickly and intentionally to move the needle there. So does that answer your question?
It does. Thanks, Jeff. That was really helpful.
Oh, sure. Yep.
Ed, anything you want to add?
At this point, no, I
This is Beth
think.
Hartman. Can I ask a follow-up question?
Yeah, go ahead.
So, as I think ahead to the spring semester when we're going to be asked to flesh out those longer term plans, is anyone thinking about the template for that? Because like Elizabeth Adams, we're also beginning work on the 6-page document, and I'm finding it really challenging to begin with those broad strokes and then narrow to the current academic year. And so I don't know, what is the thinking for the next stage of the 2025 documents and planning?
It's a great question, and if you saw me chuckle, it was because our last 2.5 months have been so whirlwind that we barely know what's coming next week, much less at the end of September. So we have thought about it. We've begun to discuss it at a high level, but we don't have more than just a high-level idea of where we want to take it. And so I know it's going to be consultative. I know we're going to want to think about campuses that already have student success plans. So, the idea of being somewhat flexible, but also having some type of template will be there. If you have suggestions as you fill this out and, over the next month or so, I will say that, the last 2 months have been pretty crazy in terms of the goal setting and all the efforts towards graduation of 2025. And the next month, probably culminating with the board meeting on the 21st, will also be equally as busy. And we were unlikely to come to you with a very clear template before then. So as you're working on these documents and as you're thinking this through on your campuses, if you have suggestions to help guide us with that, we'd love to hear them.
Okay, thank you.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Okay, so I just want clarification on the 35 million. So it's a 1-year deal. It's just for funding for 1 year, and they're going to focus on 4-year graduation rates for freshmen and 2-year transfers. So does that mean that we focus on our fall 12 cohort for freshmen, and our, transfer would be fall 14? Is that type of data that they want? Or is that a short term?
You've already given it more thought than they did.
Sorry.
Really, no, that's fine. Really, all it is a one-time allocation for 35. They want to know what can you do quickly with that money so that it improves those rates. They don't have in mind a cohort that we would target and say, here, this is the one that was affected by it. I think for the short term, we'll be likely to focus on the kind of thing Jeff was just describing, looking at quickie interventions you can do for students on track to graduate in 4.5 years and instead make them graduate in 4. Is there anything you could do right away to spend some money that way? I should also let you know, though, that the formula for taking the 35, if we get it, and dividing it among the 23 campuses is completely undecided. And so you also can't predict whether or how much of the 35 you would get to do that with. What we're asking you for in those plans is really just a preview of a preview.
Well, I figured that it would be divided equally. I've been around too long. I know that. Okay, I just wanted to add some context. Thank you very much.
Fair enough. Good. You're welcome.
So Ken, Mary Beth again. At the risk of asking too many questions, I'm still a bit confused, and I would like. It seems as if we're separating out the symposium from the strategic plans that campus is putting together. Because if the 35 million is also about increasing transfer rates.
Transfer outcomes.
Transfer outcomes. The 35 is transfer outcomes. A 2-year transfer out. No, transfer outcomes for the transfer students who enroll at the CSU. Right?
That's it.
Correct.
Okay,
Yes.
got it. I understand now. Thank you.
Yep. Really glad you raised that, Mary Beth.
Thank you.
Sure. Well, I told you we had only 10 minutes of material and we would finish early, so that's how much you can trust me. Thanks for the good discussion, folks. We will send out to the Provost and VPSA listservs the link to the recording of this webinar. So if you would like a recording or if you have colleagues who would like one, that's where you can get it from. We'll also post the link on the homepage of the graduation initiative. That is calstate.edu/graduate.
Yep. Happy Friday. Thank you, everyone.
Take care, guys.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.